Hello, thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Preventing Burnout with Boundaries. My name is Dara Ray. I'm the president of Learn and your host today. Please keep in mind that this content is provided for general informational purposes only and is not to be considered legal, financial, or health advice. Please consult with your legal, financial, healthcare, or other service providers before taking action based on this information. Today, we are delighted to invite and welcome Theresa Wilbanks, owner of Sustainable Caregiving. I had the opportunity to meet Theresa at a conference in Virginia, the Care Colloquium, where she shared her story, and I wanted to share what she does with our community here. Theresa cared for her father until his passing at 99 years of age. During that time, she experienced the raging river of emotions that comes with caring for a family member. Overwhelmed and drowning, she navigated toward a more sustainable caregiving experience, and she founded Sustainable Caregiving and now works with fellow family caregivers to help them navigate their caregiving journey. Thank you so much for joining us today. Theresa, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, thank you, Dara. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so as you said, I cared for Dad. He passed in December of 2020. And it was probably about 2 years into caregiving that I realized I was not on a sustainable path. Something needed to change. And so I deconstructed the pain and the emotions and just the whole experience and figured out some things that could help make it a sustainable experience. And setting boundaries was really one of the most important things. And boundaries weren't on my radar. I think it came naturally to use them at work, but in this caregiving experience where everything is so personal, it was uncomfortable. So when I realized that I needed to set boundaries, I really had to learn how to do it in this new environment, this new setting. And it was a process. And I knew that I was already helping caregivers with resources. And this was just something else that I wanted to help them with. So the 12 Sustainable Caregiving Strategies boundaries is really the first one. And I felt like had I learned how to set boundaries in the beginning of the caregiving experience, I would not have slipped in down the slippery slope into the flames of burnout, as I say, because, there are just a few things that if we can do early on in the experience, it just helps set us up for a more sustainable caregiving journey.
Well, with that, I think I will hand this over to you so you can give us that education and share with our community the importance of boundaries for sustainable caregiving.
Hi, I'm Theresa Wilbanks with Sustainable Caregiving. Welcome to Prevent Burnout with Boundaries. We're going to talk about how setting, modifying, and reinforcing boundaries can prevent caregiver burnout. What is burnout? Well, caregiver burnout occurs when we've given too much of ourselves without attention to our well being. The consistent stress from caregiving, when we are beyond our limits, results in more pressure because our coping mechanisms are no longer effective at restoring our energy. In this state, we're exhausted, more easily overwhelmed, and more quickly irritated. We often have trouble sleeping, which adds to the negative cycle. I view burnout as a spectrum, and it's a slippery slope that leads to the flames of burnout. One reason that boundaries are important to prevent burnout is that caregiving changes our relationships. Suppose our care recipient is our parent. Our relationship shifts from parent, adult, child to care receiver, caregiver. It may be a gradual shift over several years or a sudden shift in the case of a hospitalization or a disease diagnosis. Regardless of the pace of progression, responsibilities change over time, and these changing responsibilities require that we reassess our boundaries. When we begin helping our family member, we begin interacting and engaging with a whole new set of people, and even learn a new language that includes acronyms and medical terms. Healthcare professionals become members of our care team. As the leader of the care team, you're charged with communicating information, delegating tasks, and determining and balancing priorities. It's a lot of work and responsibility that would be challenging enough without the added worry about your care recipient that seeps into every decision and every interaction. If you haven't given much thought to boundaries before now, this is the time to reevaluate roles, relationships, and limits so that you and those traveling with you on your caregiving journey feel respected and supported. Setting boundaries is one of the sustainable caregiving strategies. Caregiving is sustainable when we use strategies that help us care for ourselves while we care for our family member for as long as needed. Imagine your caregiving journey is like being in a raft on a river. The river has calm sections, obstacles, rapids, and a few waterfalls. At times, it feels like we've been tossed out of the raft and we're drowning. When we employ certain strategies to protect our well being, manage the emotions and the stress, the river doesn't change, but how we navigate the river changes. We step into the flow. This quote by Brene Brown says a lot. Compassionate people ask for what they need, they say no when they need to, and when they say yes, they mean it. They're compassionate because their boundaries keep them out of resentment. So, what are boundaries? Boundaries are limits that protect our emotional and physical well being. Boundaries offer the opportunity for us to be more in control of our time and how we spend it. Without boundaries, the overwhelm of caregiving can feel like being in the middle of a whirlpool of emotions. We may feel like we are drowning, can't get our breath, and question how we're going to survive. Our boundaries help us create a calm space around us and help us preserve our energy. Setting boundaries is a way of respecting and protecting ourselves. When you choose when to give, you save enough of you so that you're able to give when you choose. When we identify what behaviors we can accept and what behaviors aren't acceptable, setting and sharing our expectations can reduce feelings of resentment and frustration, yours and the feelings of the folks who are helping you care for your family member. In the same way, boundaries help us define what we believe to be our responsibilities and what responsibilities we can't accept. As we said, one reason that setting limits is so important is because boundaries protect us from burnout. With that in mind, the best time to set boundaries is when you're first wading into caregiving. You may have started helping with finances or running errands. Without boundaries, tasks that are at first occasional can grow so much that it becomes easy to place our well-being last. When we continually prioritize the needs of others over our well-being, our emotional state and our coping abilities are diminished, leading to feelings of overwhelm and a state of being that is not sustainable. Another indication that we need to set boundaries is when we feel like we are being taken advantage of. Anger, resentment, and frustration can be the signal that we need to communicate our needs and our limits. Boundaries can help determine who is on your care team and who is only adding drama to the experience. In addition to relationships changing with our care recipient and care professionals, relationships change with other family members and friends. Boundaries are crucial to help us stay connected to what makes us feel whole. In the beginning, I started by helping Dad a few days a week, and it wasn't my conscious intention, but 2 days a week turned into assisting with daily activities. Bit by bit, we can find ourselves giving up our hobbies and interests until we're entrenched without a clear way out from under the tasks. What starts as fulfilling work becomes oppressive and frustrating when we don't keep our life. Prioritizing our well-being helps us keep our life, which means protecting our other relationships and protecting ourselves from burnout and exhausting our abilities to cope with caregiving challenges. Setting boundaries is self-care. These boundaries will help you prioritize your well-being while you're caring for your family member. Healthy boundaries help us maintain healthy relationships. Because caregiver burnout occurs when we've given too much of ourselves, establishing boundaries helps us communicate our needs so that we have more control over how we spend our time and our energy. Setting boundaries with those who are close to us is hard. It's understandable if you're skilled at setting boundaries at work, but are less confident setting boundaries with family and friends. This is where emotions complicate the process. We may feel like it's risky to set boundaries with friends and family, the people who are accustomed to our open limits. How will they react? Anger, judgment? You will be removing the established expectations that your relationship had been built on. You aren't giving as much of yourself anymore. Let's say we're not in the habit of setting boundaries. We may struggle with people pleasing. We say yes to everything, and when we hear a no from someone, we may think, how dare they? On the other hand, when we begin setting boundaries, we're more likely to accept and even expect our friends' boundaries. We become more comfortable saying no and accepting a no from others. We grow to understand and respect healthy boundaries. Yet, to make things more complicated, boundary lines shift as circumstances change. Learning to set and maintain boundaries in a new setting takes awareness and practice. With practice, we can determine when our boundaries are too rigid, too flexible, or just right. For example, there are varying degrees of opening up to people and sharing personal information. The extreme ends of sharing are rarely opening up versus oversharing. Somewhere in the middle is where healthy boundaries are formed. Another example of too rigid versus too flexible is never asking for help versus never saying no to a request for help. Setting boundaries is also hard because communicating boundaries is often not a one and done conversation. Our boundaries will be tested, and reinforcement requires re-communicating the boundary and the consequences. Or a boundary may change, and you will want to communicate the new parameters. In addition, as we mentioned earlier, you will find yourself in the new role of communicating and coordinating care for your family member, which can feel awkward and intimidating at first. Boundaries will help you manage professional interactions with people who are helping with an intimate situation. There are several barriers that can make setting boundaries uncomfortable, so let's explore those next. It's helpful to understand the barriers to setting boundaries so that when we encounter them, we recognize them and are more prepared to overcome the hurdles. A common barrier to establishing limits is that we haven't been taught how to set boundaries and therefore don't always recognize the need. Another barrier occurs when we realize a boundary is necessary but feel guilty about setting the limit. Or we set a boundary and it's rejected or resisted. We may be interacting with someone who doesn't set their own boundaries or respect those set by others. In this case, consistent reinforcement may be challenging due to uncomfortable confrontations that might cause us to ignore a crossed boundary. I experienced all three of these, and it was several years into caregiving before I realized why I was struggling. I had set and reinforced boundaries at work and in other areas of my life, but this was different. This was so personal. This was my dad and the people helping me care for him. Boundaries weren't on my radar. And then when I realized that boundaries were exactly what I needed, the guilt. And then when I finally summoned the courage and set boundaries, they were trampled. One example, Nellie was a neighbor and a friend, and we were also paying her to check on Dad. We'd worked with home care agencies in the past, but this was the arrangement that worked for us at the time. My husband, Joe, and I were able to work remotely and get away for a few weeks at a time. And at this point, Nellie lived across the street and checked on Dad twice a day, often bringing food. In the afternoon, they would sit out back and share stories, and she was a good friend. Joe and I were living about 15 minutes away, and as I began to spend more time at Dad's and worry when I wasn't there, we decided that we needed to move back in with him since he was not willing to move in with us. It wasn't an easy choice, and to this day, I don't know that it was the right one, but nonetheless, we did, and Nellie continued her twice-a-day visits. She didn't knock because I asked her to just walk in. If Dad heard the bell, it made no sense for him to make the trek to the front door. The problem was that Joe and I were both working, and Nellie's arrival was startling and often included a hello yell of sorts. The help that Nellie had been providing was no longer needed, and on top of that, Dad loved Nellie, but a little went a long way. And when I asked what he thought about Nellie coming once a day rather than twice a day, he said 3 times a week would be better, and I don't want any more food. She brought lots of food, and while it was good, it just wasn't what Dad or we ate, just a bit too saucy. I was anxious about the conversation, but prepared quite a bit and sat down with Nellie the next time she popped in. The conversation went well. I shared how much we appreciated her and valued her friendship, and explained that things had changed since Joe and I moved in. There would be no change in pay. We just wanted Nellie to come less frequently and not bring food. I was gentle and direct, and we came to an understanding for 2 days. And then it was as if we had never had the conversation. Twice-a-day visits. Nellie was a force. And it was all coming from a place of love. But we were close to pulling the plug altogether. I sat with her again and added the consequences if she continued to pop in. And I asked her to take the food back that she had brought. I felt horrible, but the arrangement was not working and it was adding so much stress. That second conversation did the trick, for a little while anyway. It's important to remember that while setting boundaries can feel selfish, the opposite is true. Well maintained boundaries are a gift to you and those in your caregiving circle. When you start to feel guilty about setting a boundary, remind yourself that setting boundaries is not selfish, but an essential part of self care as a caregiver. Boundaries will protect your compassion reserves, your capacity for compassion, so that interactions with the care team are respectful and in line with your values. If I had not set limits and had not had these conversations with Nellie, the frustration would have built until the resentment destroyed our relationship altogether. Boundaries may be set with anyone who impacts the care we provide for our loved one. Setting boundaries with ourselves, self-imposed boundaries, may be the most valuable of the boundaries we set. Setting these limits allows us to sustain ourselves as we provide care. As we said, as caregiving tasks increase, it is essential to reevaluate limits so that you're not giving so much of yourself that your well-being suffers. How much is too much? How much time? How much headspace? How much energy is too much to devote to all that goes into taking care of a family member? This is for you to decide, and the answer may change frequently based on your situation and circumstances. Defining a limit around care responsibilities is one of the most important boundaries we can set. This requires that we accept that we cannot do it all, not without consequences. When we accept help, we gain time for ourselves so that we can use that time to focus on our well-being. We can set a boundary around worry. When we realize that our anxiety is not productive, it may be time to move to acceptance or time to come up with a plan to address the worry. Dad had interstitial lung disease, and his anxiety over the progression became all-consuming. And it began to take over my thoughts as well as his. I worried about him worrying. I realized he needed help, and I needed to learn new skills and set emotional boundaries. I contacted our hospice social worker, and we came up with a plan. We organized a visitor to answer his questions and listen to his concerns. And I learned how to engage with Dad to validate his fears and then turn his attention to other topics. I set a boundary around how much time I would spend on the subject, not only in conversation with Dad, but in my thoughts. Another limit may be necessary when care responsibilities involve physical risk or become too intimate for your comfort. For example, you may decide that you'll not be able to help your family member with showering or other activities of daily living, and can develop a plan when that level of care is required. Boundaries help us prioritize and protect self-care time. When we schedule self-care activities and communicate that we are engaged in an activity that supports our well-being, we can reinforce our boundary around self-care as needed. This is a good time to share a signal that helps us identify when a boundary has been crossed. Let's say we've set a boundary. We've shared that we are taking a break for self-care, and then we are interrupted. We may feel a touch of anger. Anger can signal that a boundary has been crossed. Awareness that we cultivate through mindfulness helps us pause, be curious, and identify that the source of the anger is a crossed boundary. The pause helps us act rather than react so that we can reinforce the boundary with compassion. Boundaries with family members can help us maintain relationships. Limits may be set around when to have conversations regarding your loved one's care. Suppose a family member frequently drops by and offers suggestions and advice. In that case, it may feel like criticism when you're exhausted and overwhelmed by the responsibilities of day-to-day care. It may help to establish guidelines around communication concerning care. With mindfulness and compassion, you can let them know that they are important to you and that the topic is important, but that in the moment you cannot give it the attention that is deserved. An informal meeting once a week could be more productive. Another time when setting boundaries is important but can feel uncomfortable is when your care recipient is transitioning. Well-meaning family members may insist that you take a break, but maybe you don't want to do so, or you would rather take a short break. This is for you to decide. Setting boundaries with paid caregivers and aides is essential. Limits can be set around sharing personal information. The folks who help you care for your family member can become like part of the family. If this relationship becomes too familiar, it can be uncomfortable communicating when there's a concern with how tasks are accomplished, or if personal conversation interferes with responsibilities. Limits can be set around tasks. For example, if you share space with your care recipient, you may appreciate that the aide helps you keep your family members' living spaces clean, but prefer to manage other areas yourself. Clear communication can avoid hurt feelings when a kind gesture from your aide feels like overstepping. In general, when more rigid boundaries are established early, it's easier to move to more flexible boundaries. It's not easy, however, to start with flexible boundaries and shift to more rigid boundaries. Boundaries with friends and neighbors become important as caregiving intensifies. Friends of your care recipient may drop in unannounced and might disrupt the schedule. The disruption might start a stress snowball. Social interaction is important. Communication and coordination with folks will show respect for the relationship and demonstrate that you value the friendship. Establishing boundaries around visits and communication can help preserve relationships and allow mutually beneficial interactions. When we think about setting limits with our care receiver, the boundaries are actually for us rather than for them. Challenges may arise from living in the same space. Relationship dynamics may be exposed that would otherwise have been kept private. For example, your care recipient may be privy to uncomfortable conversations between you and your young children, or between you and your spouse. Boundaries can help us share appropriate personal information without oversharing relationship details or receiving unwanted opinions. Shared space also keeps us in a heightened state of awareness regarding our care recipient's mood. We can't be responsible for someone else's happiness or contentment. If we find that our care recipient's mood dictates our mood, it's a signal to revisit boundaries. In the same way, we may encourage our family member to eat well or exercise. But when we find ourselves insisting, we can acknowledge that the resulting conflict is harmful to our well-being and may even be crossing our family member's boundary. We can set a boundary around how much energy we will invest in insisting. Consequences are crucial to boundary setting, and this can be complicated when dealing with an aging adult with cognitive decline or a dementia diagnosis. If your care recipient cannot remember that a boundary was set, then the rules must be self-enforced. Let's say you've requested that a parent does not enter your personal space without knocking, but this continues to occur because your care recipient forgets. You will just need to lock the door. Since communication is key to setting and reinforcing boundaries, let's go over some conversation tips. You will want to be clear in your intention so that you can be clear in your communication. Respectfully and with as few words as possible, communicate your boundary. Word the request in terms of what you need and why you need it, rather than using the word you. You might say, I don't have the bandwidth for that right now. Maybe you say, I need some space, rather than you need to stop. Share the consequence if the boundary is crossed, and be firm and unapologetic. Because we set our boundaries for us, if they are not working, it is our responsibility to reinforce or adjust them as needed. For example, if we set a boundary around when we communicate with our sibling about our parents' care, and they call us at 11 p.m. at night with a suggestion, great idea. They may have crossed a boundary around appropriate times to discuss care details, and we can gently reinforce it by reminding them of our scheduled time to talk. You need sleep to be at your best, and a late night conversation interferes with a good night's sleep. As you prepare for the conversation, you still might be thinking, I'm not sure if setting a boundary will work. One thing you do know is that the current situation is not working, so set and communicate the boundary. The situation will improve. Just remember that setting, modifying, and reinforcing boundaries involves a lot of communication. Boundaries are not fixed, and they must widen and narrow and adapt to the circumstances. And as we said, the conversation around boundaries are rarely one and done, so you will likely have a chance to revisit the details. So our boundaries help us consistently prioritize our well-being. Prioritizing our well-being cultivates our capacity for compassion, importantly self-compassion. And this is how we prevent burnout. To get started working with boundaries, you might explore how the relationship has changed between you and your care recipient, and how boundaries have changed or not to reflect the new relationship. You might think about the last time you felt anger. What boundary may have been crossed? What's not working that setting a boundary might fix? These are some questions to ask yourself that may lead you to recognize where boundaries are needed. For your journal, if you're not keeping a journal, this is a great time to start. You could consider it your caregiving journey travel diary. Just like with any travel, you will experience growth, and your journal can be a wonderful document of where you have been and how far you have come. To use your journal to explore how boundaries could help you prioritize your well-being, you might start by listing the people who are a regular part of your care team. What opportunities exist to establish, adjust, or reinforce a boundary? Maybe describe the conversation that would allow you to set or reinforce the boundary with compassion. Another idea, I like to use quotes as journal prompts, and a quote that fits well here is, "You cannot adjust the wind, but you can adjust your sails." The quote is credited to Cora Hatch. When we find ourselves in the role of caregiver, whether we arrive suddenly or gradually, we definitely need to adjust our sails. And a big part of that includes setting boundaries. So you could journal your thoughts on how you can adjust your sails using boundaries. Some ways to practice new information about boundaries include to be mindful of feelings of anger, because anger is often a clue that a boundary has been crossed. Another step you might take after journaling the communication around a boundary that you would like to set is to begin the conversation. It may take more than one. It will likely take more than one conversation. I'm Theresa Wilbanks with Sustainable Caregiving. Thank you for watching. You can download the handout that covers what we discussed in this session. And for more on this topic and strategies for sustainable caregiving, go to sustainablecaregiving.com or check out Navigating the Caregiver River, A Journey to Sustainable Caregiving, available on Amazon. And the strategies are also explored in the Self-Caregiving Strategies podcast.
Theresa, wow. Thank you so much for sharing those wonderful lessons with us that we all need to remember as family caregivers to help us be more successful and navigate this caregiving river, as you call it, a bit better for ourselves and for our own health. Can you please help our visitors understand how to learn more about your approach and what you offer?
Yes, folks can go to sustainablecaregiving.com, where you can download the free 12 Sustainable Caregiving Strategies ebook. So there you can kind of see more about setting boundaries and also just explore the other sustainable caregiving strategies. So sustainablecaregiving.com is the best way to locate all those resources on my website.
Well, thank you again for sharing your knowledge with Learn and for providing this amazing training to our community.
Thank you, Dara.
For those of you who have been watching, we do invite you to join the Learn mailing list so you can be advised of new education and training posted on our website. Go to learnidaho.org/mailing-list. And just a reminder that you can find more than 100 topics in the Learn online video library in the aging and caregiving topic areas of health, wealth, lifestyle, caregiving, community resources, and technology. Go to learnidaho.org and click on the video library panel at the very front page. And finally, just a reminder that Learn Lifelong Education and Aging Resource Network is a nonprofit organization in the Treasure Valley of Idaho with a mission to help people navigate the joys and challenges of aging and caregiving. We serve as a trusted source of community information and resources for the community, by the community, and we do that providing free education for mature adults, family caregivers, and the professionals that serve them. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hope to see you again soon.